going to explain to you why there is no single Latino electorate, why Latinos in California are so much different than Texas, and why those in Florida are so much different than those in Arizona and New York. See, one of the biggest mistakes in national political analysis is the idea that Latino voters form a single national electorate. They don't. There's no such thing as a universal Latino vote. In fact, there is no Latino vote, but there are Latino voters, and that's a really important distinction you've got to understand. And these voters are shaped by history, economics, migration patterns, and political experience. And nowhere is this example clearer than when you compare California and Texas. California is often treated as the blueprint for Latino political behavior. But California is not the future. California is the outcome of a very specific political history. Specifically in the 1990s, California made a deliberate choice to politicize ethnicity. An infamous measure taken up by the voters in California in 1994 was called Proposition 187. Dubbed the Save Our State Initiative, this brought mass deportation rhetoric that we're hearing now to the people of the state of California a generation ago. State-sponsored hostility toward immigrant communities. The measure itself, voted on by an overwhelming majority of Californians, essentially would have prohibited any government services to those that were undocumented, including removing children from classrooms, not serving dying patients in emergency rooms. And while it passed overwhelmingly in 1994, it had two unintended consequences. The first is it was thrown out just days after the election because it was ruled unconstitutional. But second, and most importantly, it established a framework through which a whole generation of Latino politicians viewed themselves as an ethnic voting bloc, surpassing those class concerns that have been emerging recently. And that struggle is going to define what happens going forward. So these choices that California made did not just mobilize Latino voters, it consolidated them multi-generationally. For the first time, what you saw was recently naturalized immigrant voters that had become citizens, voting with people whose families had been here for centuries. California did not drift blue because Latinos became progressive. It became blue because politics became punitive, and Latinos were responding to that. So here's a question that rarely gets asked. If California were the future of Latino politics, why did we witness that recent rightward shift in 2024 among Latino voters? And why did it happen everywhere else in the country before it happened in California? Well, in many ways, California, again, isn't the future of Latino politics at all. Curiously, it may be an outlier. When the state turned against them, Latino voters responded collectively. Race and class collapsed into that same political identity. This was not ideology. It was self-defense. And once that alignment hardened, it became durable. California Democrats inherited that coalition, and while it lasted a generation, they did not build it. California Democrats were not providing an aspirational policy agenda that Latinos were motivated to vote for. Latino voters were voting antagonistically in response to an aggressive Republican Party. Put in other terms, Latinos were voting against Republicans more than they were voting for Democrats. Now, Texas followed a different path in the same 1990s era. First of all, Texas has a longer history of Mexican-American presence. For many families, the border crossed them. And that changes profoundly political psychology. For most of its history, Texas Latinos have been economically driven voters, much more so than an ethnic voting bloc. Or at a minimum, they weren't in competition with one another. Texas Latinos have been more rural, more evangelical, and more economically conservative, at least up until recently. And for decades, Texas politics did not force an ethnic consolidation. The seamlessness through which Latinos, Hispanics, as they often say in Texas, lived side by side or even intermingled with Tejanos or Texans, white folks from Texas, is part of the lore of the territory. It's part of the common narrative, part of the shared experience. And that difference matters. In California, ethnic threat preceded economic assimilation. In Texas, economic assimilation often came first. which means partisan behavior developed differently. That's why you could have a George W. Bush become governor of Texas at the same time a Pete Wilson became governor of California. Two entirely different politicians, both Republicans, one in George W. Bush, very welcoming and amenable to demographic change. It was George W. Bush who famously said, anybody willing to walk across 300 miles of desert to work for minimum wage is somebody I want working in Texas. At the same time, Governor Wilson was supporting ballot measures that would preclude anybody who was here from being undocumented from being provided with any government services. And that's in large part why Latino voters in Texas have remained more fluid. Not more conservative necessarily, but certainly more flexible. But here's where the current moment matters again. Texas politics under Governor Abbott and with its two Republican senators are now experimenting with the same politics that California used 30 years ago. Aggressive enforcement, ethnicized, angry rhetoric, visible state power, cracking down on communities. And these early signs are very familiar. As politics hardens, Latino voting behavior often follows. Ethnic de-alignment accelerates. And Florida tells yet even another story about us. Cuban and Venezuelan voters are political emigres, not economic migrants. This is a very important distinction. Keep in mind, Miami, one of the most Latino cities in America, is one of the most significant outliers in understanding national Latino politics because it is predominantly Central and South American. And most of the power structure is dominated by Cubans, of course, who've been here since the 1960s after the fall of the Batista regime, the rise of antagonism with Fidel Castro, and most recently, Venezuelan emigres coming for political reasons. Both of these groups, incidentally, came here largely for political reasons, escaping communism, escaping dictatorship, having had their private property seized. Many of them came here with some level of wealth and a disproportionately high number of more college-educated or postgraduate educated voters. These Cuban and Venezuelans redefined what it politically meant to be Latinos, very different and distinct from the Mexican diaspora that dominates California and Texas. These politics are shaped by state failure elsewhere, particularly Cuba and Venezuela. Anti-authoritarianism is not abstract, and it is deeply personal. That makes Florida Latinos far more responsive to messaging about socialism, state power, and institutional collapse. Now, Arizona sits somewhere in between, a border state when enforcement has been hyper-visible. Sheriff Joe Arpaio in SB 1070 about a decade ago did more to mobilize Latino voters than any Democratic campaign. Again, it was an external attack on the community that created a mobilizing effort, a negative push on the community that made it realize it was under attack, that had it mobilize, vote in higher numbers, and vote against Republicans. It was not aspirational. It was not a policy agenda that was rallying Latinos around the Democratic Party. It was to vote against a party. Again, these ethnic blocs are not inevitable. They were created. These blocs were created, and that's why national messaging keeps failing. Campaigns speak to Latinos as if history doesn't matter, as if place doesn't matter, as if lived experience is interchangeable. And of course it isn't. Latino voters respond to the politics around them. When politics is economic, they vote economically. When politics forces them to become ethnic, they respond ethnically. And the pattern is consistent. Only the trigger changes. This is also why demographic inevitability is a dangerous illusion. You see, demography isn't destiny. Politics and place intervenes. Bad politics can harden coalitions against a party. Good politics can loosen them. And that choice right now, for Latinos anyway, is still being made in real time. California shows us what happens when politics forces identity. Texas shows us what happens when identity is not forced, until it is. And Florida shows us how memory reshapes ideology. Arizona shows us how enforcement mobilizes. There is no single electorate. There are Latino voters responding to political environments. And understanding that distinction is the difference between reading elections correctly and being perpetually surprised by them. In the next episode, we'll talk about what both parties are still getting wrong and why Republicans struggle to break through sustainably with Latino voters even when conditions seem favorable. I'm Mike Madrid, author of The Latino Century: How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. You've been following this series of Understanding the Latino Vote for the Great Transformation. Subscribe, like, share, and most importantly, offer up your comments on what other topics you'd like me to tackle so that we can do further episodes to help you understand more about the Latino vote in America.